The cost of this imposed war for Sierra Leone and its people has been incalculable.
Not doing anything to people who were proved to be corrupt.
Valentine Strasser, the youngest African president, remains a pivotal figure in Sierra Leone's history. His ascent to power, marked by a military coup, heralded a period of significant political upheaval. This video delves into Strasser's early life, military background, leadership, and eventual fall, offering insights into his complex legacy and the broader implications of his rule for Sierra Leone and African politics. Early life and military background. Valentine Esagragbo Melvin Strasser, born on April 26, 1967, in Freetown, Sierra Leone, grew up in a period marked by political instability and economic challenges. His early life, like many of his contemporaries, was overshadowed by the post-independence struggles of a nation grappling with its identity and governance. Strasser's youth coincided with a time when Sierra Leone was undergoing significant social and political transformations, which undoubtedly influenced his perspectives and aspirations. Strasser's education began in Freetown, but details about his early schooling remain sparse. However, it is known that from a young age, he exhibited a strong interest in military affairs. This interest eventually led him to join the Republic of Sierra Leone military forces. His decision to pursue a military career was not unusual for his generation, as the military offered a semblance of stability and a clear career path in a country struggling with economic and political uncertainties. Once enlisted, Strasser quickly rose through the ranks. His early military career was characterized by rigorous training and a deep commitment to discipline. He was known among his peers for his dedication and leadership qualities.
That we are committed to fulfilling the desires and aspirations of our people.
Traits that would later propel him to the forefront of Sierra Leone's political stage. During his time in the military, Strasser received training both within Sierra Leone and abroad, which broadened his exposure to military tactics and leadership styles. The military environment in which Strasser matured was one of strict hierarchy and discipline, but it was also a melting pot of different ethnicities and backgrounds. Sierra Leone, with its diverse ethnic composition, reflected this diversity in its military structure. This environment played a crucial role in shaping Strasser's views on leadership and governance, as he learned to navigate and lead within this diverse milieu. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Sierra Leone's political landscape was fraught with corruption and inefficiency. The government, led by President Joseph Saidu Momo, was struggling to address the economic hardships and rampant corruption that plagued the country. During this period, Strasser, along with other young military officers, grew increasingly disillusioned with the government's inability to bring about meaningful change. This discontent sowed the seeds for what would become a defining moment in both Strasser's life and the history of Sierra Leone. As a young officer, Strasser was deployed to various parts of the country, including key regions where he witnessed firsthand the suffering and frustration of the populace. These experiences were instrumental in shaping his worldview and his eventual decision to take a more active role in addressing the country's challenges. The widespread poverty, inequity, and corruption he observed only fueled his desire for reform and change. The pivotal moment came in 1992, when Strasser, then a young lieutenant, led a group of similarly disenchanted soldiers in a military coup that would oust President Momo. This bold move catapulted the 25-year-old Strasser into the global spotlight as the world's youngest head of state. The coup was largely bloodless and was initially met with widespread support from a populace desperate for change. Rise to power. The 1992 coup. The 1992 coup d'etat in Sierra Leone, led by then-Lieutenant Valentine Strasser, marked a dramatic shift in the nation's political landscape. This audacious move by Strasser and his fellow young officers, mostly in their 20s, toppled the government of President Joseph Saidu Momo, ending over 2 decades of one-party rule and setting the stage for a new, albeit tumultuous, chapter in Sierra Leone's history. The seeds of the coup were sown in the prevailing socio-political and economic conditions of Sierra Leone. In the early 1990s, the country was grappling with rampant corruption, widespread poverty, and a disillusioned populace. The government's ineffectiveness in dealing with these issues had eroded public trust. For the young officers in the military, including Strasser, the situation was intolerable. They saw themselves as agents of change, driven by a desire to improve the living conditions of their fellow citizens. On April 29, 1992, Strasser, along with a group of young officers, seized power in a bloodless coup. The coup was carefully orchestrated and executed with precision, reflecting the military training and discipline of its leaders. Strasser and his group took control of key government and military installations in Freetown, the capital city, with little to no resistance from the existing government forces. The swift success of the coup could be attributed to several factors. Firstly, there was widespread dissatisfaction with President Momo's government. His administration was viewed as corrupt and ineffective, particularly in its handling of the economy and the emerging rebel threat from the Revolutionary United Front, RUF. Secondly, the military, which had been neglected and poorly equipped, shared this dissatisfaction. The coup leaders capitalized on this discontent, positioning themselves as saviors of the nation. Strasser's ascension to power was met with a mix of optimism and skepticism. Many Sierra Leoneans, tired of years of misrule, saw the young military officers as a beacon of hope. The international community, however, was more cautious, expressing concerns about the implications of a military takeover in an already fragile state. In his first address to the nation, Strasser justified the coup as a necessary intervention to save the country from further decay. He promised to end corruption, restore the economy, and bring about much-needed reforms. He established the National Provisional Ruling Council, NPRC, with himself as the head, signaling the beginning of a new governance structure. This council comprised young military officers, a stark contrast to the previous government's older civilian politicians. One of the first actions of Strasser's regime was to suspend the constitution and dissolve all political parties, effectively establishing military rule. This move, while consolidating the NPRC's power, also raised concerns about the future of democracy in Sierra Leone. However, Strasser assured the populace and the international community that these were temporary measures aimed at stabilizing the country. The NPRC, under Strasser's leadership, initiated several reforms. They launched a campaign against corruption, leading to the arrest and trial of several former government officials. This move was popular among the people but also raised human rights concerns, as the due process was often overlooked. Another significant challenge faced by the NPRC was the ongoing conflict with the RUF. The rebellion, which had begun in 1991, had plunged parts of the country into violence and instability. Strasser's government took a hardline stance against the rebels, intensifying military efforts to quell the uprising. However, this approach led to further violence and atrocities, complicating the security situation in the country. Governing style and domestic policies. Valentine Strasser's ascension to power in 1992 as the head of the National Provisional Ruling Council, NPRC, marked a significant shift in Sierra Leone's governance. His rule was characterized by a blend of authoritarianism, youthful energy, and an ambitious agenda aimed at transforming the country. However, the effectiveness of his policies and governing style was a subject of debate and controversy. Strasser's governance style was predominantly military-oriented, reflecting his background and the nature of the coup that brought him to power. He ruled through the NPRC, a council composed mainly of young military officers, which took decisions collectively, but under his leadership. This military council replaced the existing civilian government structures, centralizing power in the hands of Strasser and his close associates. One of the first and most significant actions of Strasser's government was the suspension of the 1978 Constitution. This move effectively abolished all political parties and imposed a ban on political activities.
What is their problem so that they could negotiate and then hand over to whatever government they want to.
While this decision was justified as a means to stabilize the country and root out corruption, it also stifled political freedoms and set the stage for a military dictatorship. Under Strasser, the NPRC embarked on a campaign against corruption, which was rampant in the previous regime. This campaign led to the arrest and detention of several former government officials and business people accused of corruption and mismanagement of public funds. While this initiative was initially popular among the populace, the lack of transparency and due process in these proceedings raised significant human rights concerns. Another focus of Strasser's domestic policy was the economy. Sierra Leone was facing severe economic challenges, including high inflation, widespread poverty, and a lack of basic services. The NPRC implemented austerity measures and attempted economic reforms to stabilize the economy and attract foreign investment. These measures included restructuring the civil service, reducing government expenditure, and liberalizing the economy. However, the impact of these reforms was limited, as the country continued to struggle with economic woes, exacerbated by the ongoing civil war. The civil war with the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, was a dominant issue during Strasser's regime. His government took a hardline approach to the conflict, prioritizing military action over negotiations. The NPRC increased military spending and launched several offensives against the RUF. While these actions demonstrated a strong stance against the rebels, they also led to an escalation of violence and human rights abuses by both sides. The conflict continued to devastate the country, hindering development and causing immense suffering to the civilian population. In terms of social policies, Strasser's government faced significant challenges in improving the living conditions of the people. The country had low levels of literacy, poor health care, and inadequate infrastructure. While the NPRC announced initiatives to address these issues, progress was slow and hampered by the ongoing conflict and limited resources. Strasser's rule also saw a tightening of control over the media and civil society. The government was sensitive to criticism and often suppressed dissenting voices. This repression further curtailed civil liberties and led to an atmosphere of fear and censorship. Despite these challenges, Strasser's regime did make some positive contributions. His government initiated infrastructure projects, including road construction and rehabilitation of public buildings. There were also efforts to improve the delivery of basic services, although these were often hindered by the country's limited resources and the unstable political environment. International relations and diplomacy. Valentine Strasser's tenure as the leader of Sierra Leone was a period of significant change in the country's international relations and diplomacy. His government's foreign policy was shaped by the challenges of a nation in conflict, the need for economic support, and the complexities of engaging with a global community that was often critical of military regimes. Upon seizing power in 1992, the National Provisional Ruling Council, NPRC, led by Strasser, faced immediate international scrutiny. Many Western countries and international organizations were hesitant to fully endorse a regime that had come to power through a military coup. However, the dire situation in Sierra Leone, marked by an ongoing civil war and economic collapse, necessitated international engagement. One of Strasser's initial challenges was to gain international legitimacy for his government. He sought to reassure the international community of his commitment to restoring democracy and addressing human rights issues. The NPRC made pledges to transition to civilian rule and to improve governance in an effort to garner international support. The civil war with the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, significantly influenced Strasser's foreign policy. The conflict attracted international attention due to its brutality and the humanitarian crisis it created. Strasser's government sought international assistance to combat the RUF and stabilize the country.
We have come to regard this organization as the custodian of international peace.
This resulted in varied responses. Some countries and international bodies offered military and logistical support, while others advocated for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Strasser's regime maintained close relations with regional neighbors and organizations. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, played a significant role in Sierra Leone under Strasser. ECOWAS, particularly through its military arm, the Economic Community of West African States Monitoring Group, ECOMOG, was involved in efforts to resolve the conflict in Sierra Leone. The NPRC collaborated with ECOMOG in operations against the RUF, although this cooperation was sometimes strained by differences in strategies and objectives. The relationship with major powers like the United States and the United Kingdom was complex. While these countries were critical of the coup and expressed concerns about human rights under military rule, they also recognized the strategic importance of Sierra Leone. The US and the UK provided some level of diplomatic and humanitarian support, balancing their critique of the regime with the need to address the broader issues of regional stability and humanitarian crisis. Under Strasser, Sierra Leone also engaged with international financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank.
The central bank says redenominating the Leone will significantly reduce the amount of cash.
The country was in desperate need of economic aid and debt relief. The NPRC worked to meet the conditions set by these institutions, including economic reforms and efforts to improve governance. However, progress was hampered by the ongoing conflict and internal challenges. One notable aspect of Strasser's diplomacy was his engagement with the United Nations. The UN was actively involved in efforts to resolve the conflict in Sierra Leone, including peacekeeping and humanitarian assistance. Strasser's government worked with the UN in negotiating peace plans and facilitating humanitarian operations, although these efforts were often fraught with difficulties and setbacks. Human rights were a contentious issue in Strasser's international relations. His government faced criticism from international human rights organizations and some foreign governments for human rights abuses, both in the conduct of the war and in internal governance. Strasser's regime attempted to address these criticisms, but allegations of human rights violations continued to affect Sierra Leone's international standing. Economic challenges and reforms. The era of Valentine Strasser's leadership in Sierra Leone was marked by profound economic challenges, necessitating critical reforms. Inheriting a nation with a weakened economy, Strasser's regime faced the daunting task of revitalizing an economic landscape ravaged by years of mismanagement, corruption, and the escalating civil war. Sierra Leone, under Strasser's rule, was grappling with a deteriorating economy. The country was burdened with high inflation, a massive external debt, declining GDP, and a significant portion of the population living in poverty. These economic woes were compounded by the disruption caused by the ongoing conflict with the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, which had a devastating impact on the nation's key economic sectors, particularly mining and agriculture. One of Strasser's primary economic challenges was to stabilize the nation's currency and curb inflation.
Bank of Sierra Leone announced the move last August, insisting the public's purchasing power.
The NPRC government implemented austerity measures aimed at reducing government spending. These measures, while necessary for financial stability, were often unpopular as they led to cuts in public services and subsidies, directly impacting the lives of ordinary citizens. Another major focus for Strasser was to address the issue of external debt. Sierra Leone's debt burden was crippling, limiting the government's ability to invest in development projects. The NPRC sought assistance from international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank for debt relief and economic restructuring. This led to the implementation of structural adjustment programs, SAPs, which included currency devaluation, trade liberalization, and privatization of state-owned enterprises. While these reforms were intended to boost economic growth, they also resulted in social hardships, including increased unemployment and reduced social services. Agriculture, which was the backbone of Sierra Leone's economy, received particular attention from Strasser's government. The NPRC implemented policies to revitalize the agricultural sector, aiming to increase productivity and ensure food security. Efforts were made to improve rural infrastructure, provide better access to farming inputs, and encourage the cultivation of cash crops. However, the ongoing civil conflict severely hindered these efforts, as agricultural regions were often the most affected by the fighting. The mining sector, particularly diamond mining, was another critical area of focus. Sierra Leone's diamonds, known for their quality, had the potential to significantly boost the economy. However, the industry was plagued by mismanagement and illegal trading, which the NPRC aimed to control. Strasser's government attempted to regulate the diamond industry, reduce smuggling, and increase government revenues from diamond exports. Despite these efforts, the sector remained largely unregulated. with a significant portion of the diamond trade controlled by rebel groups, contributing to the war economy. To attract foreign investment, the NPRC government undertook measures to create a more favorable investment climate. These measures included improving the legal framework for business, reducing bureaucratic hurdles, and offering incentives to foreign investors. While there was some interest from international investors, the unstable political and security environment made significant foreign investment challenging. The Strasser regime also focused on infrastructure development as a means to stimulate economic growth. Projects were initiated to improve roads, telecommunications, and public utilities. However, the lack of adequate funding and the instability caused by the Civil War meant that progress in this area was limited. In terms of social policy, the economic reforms under Strasser had mixed impacts. On one hand, there were efforts to improve education and healthcare systems, which were crucial for long-term development. On the other hand, the austerity measures and structural adjustments led to reductions in social spending, adversely affecting the provision of basic services to the population. Human rights and civil liberties under Strasser. The tenure of Valentine Strasser as the head of Sierra Leone's government was marked by significant concerns regarding human rights and civil liberties. Despite initial promises of reform and better governance, Strasser's regime, characterized by military rule, faced widespread criticism for its handling of human rights issues. One of the most pressing human rights issues under Strasser's rule was the handling of political dissent. The suspension of the Constitution following the 1992 coup led to a curtailment of political freedoms. Political parties were banned, and the space for political opposition was severely restricted. This suppression of political rights was a major setback for democratic governance and civil liberties in Sierra Leone. The NPRC government under Strasser was often criticized for its approach to dealing with perceived opponents. There were numerous reports of arbitrary arrests, detentions without trial, and harassment of individuals perceived to be against the government. The lack of a transparent and fair judicial process further exacerbated the situation, leading to accusations of human rights abuses by international organizations and human rights groups. Another significant concern was the treatment of the press. The Strasser regime was known for its intolerance of critical media. Journalists faced harassment, censorship, and in some cases, arrest for reporting on sensitive issues or criticizing the government. This suppression of the freedom of the press was a stark deviation from the promises of reform and transparency that initially accompanied the NPRC's rise to power. The human rights situation was further complicated by the ongoing civil war with the Revolutionary United Front, RUF. The conflict was marked by extreme brutality, with widespread atrocities committed by both sides. Reports of extrajudicial killings, torture, and abuse of civilians were common. The NPRC, while engaging in military operations against the RUF, was also implicated in human rights violations, including summary executions and mistreatment of suspected rebel sympathizers. The use of child soldiers in the conflict was a particularly egregious human rights issue. Both the government forces and the RUF recruited children into their ranks, subjecting them to the horrors of war and exploitation. The international community condemned this practice, but it persisted throughout Strasser's tenure, contributing to the tragedy of the conflict. Women's rights also suffered during this period. The chaos and lawlessness brought about by the war led to an increase in gender-based violence, including rape and sexual assault. The government's response to these issues was inadequate, and the plight of women and girls in conflict zones received little attention. In response to international criticism, the Strasser regime made some efforts to address human rights concerns. However, these were often superficial and did not result in substantial changes. The government's focus remained on the military campaign against the RUF, often at the expense of civil liberties and human rights. The treatment of prisoners and conditions in detention facilities were additional areas of concern. Detainees, including political prisoners, were often held in poor conditions, with limited access to legal representation or medical care. Reports of torture and ill treatment in detention were common, raising serious human rights concerns. Opposition and internal conflicts. Valentine Strasser's rule in Sierra Leone was not without its challenges from opposition forces and internal conflicts. Despite his initial popularity, especially among the youth, Strasser's regime faced significant opposition due to its governance style, economic policies, and handling of the Civil War. The most prominent source of opposition to Strasser's rule came from the Revolutionary United Front, RUF.
They are not soldiers. These are freedom fighters.
The rebel group that had been waging a brutal civil war against the government since 1991. The RUF, led by Foday Sanko, opposed the central government and sought to overthrow it. The conflict with the RUF was characterized by extreme violence and human rights abuses, deeply impacting the country's social fabric and economy. The NPRC's military campaign against the RUF was one of Strasser's primary focuses, but it also became a source of criticism due to the resultant civilian casualties and the use of child soldiers. Within the political sphere, Strasser faced opposition from various groups and individuals who were disillusioned with military rule. The banning of political parties and suppression of political activities following the 1992 coup alienated many who had hoped for a return to civilian rule and democratic governance. The NPRC's failure to quickly transition to civilian rule as initially promised led to increased dissatisfaction and unrest among the populace. Strasser's economic policies, particularly the implementation of structural adjustment programs, SAPs, as mandated by international financial institutions, also fueled opposition. These policies, aimed at the economic stabilization and growth, led to austerity measures that negatively impacted the living standards of many Sierra Leoneans. The reduction in public spending and privatization of state-owned enterprises resulted in job losses and reduced social services, causing widespread discontent and protests. The human rights record of Strasser's regime was another major point of contention. Reports of arbitrary arrests, detention without trial, and suppression of the media and free speech led to opposition from human rights activists and organizations, both within and outside Sierra Leone. The government's harsh response to dissent further alienated many who were concerned about the erosion of civil liberties and democratic principles. Internally, the NPRC itself was not immune to conflicts and power struggles. There were reports of disagreements and rivalries among the council members, particularly regarding the handling of the war and the transition to civilian rule. These internal conflicts within the ruling council weakened the government's cohesion and effectiveness, further complicating the already tumultuous political landscape. Strasser also faced opposition from traditional leaders and local communities, especially in rural areas. The centralization of power in Freetown and the military's heavy-handed approach in dealing with local issues often led to tensions with local authorities and communities, who felt marginalized and ignored by the central government.